schools don't. And I could never ever figure that out, why it was appropriate for some schools to pay a lunchtime fee of $200 per child to a maximum of $400, while other schools, they were exempt. I think the whole idea of extra fees, I think it goes against the spirit and mandate of universal taxpayer-funded public education. The province needs to uphold the very principle of public education and stop downloading these fees to parents. Mr. Speaker, I know that we probably could debate, and I don't think we're going to get 100% commitment from Nova Scotians when we talk about lunchtime and recess as being that integral part of the school that I mentioned. But there are some fallouts from this. And simply put, that if a parent can't afford the fees, that creates a problem. And what happens now, and I mentioned earlier that times have changed. We now have situations in Nova Scotia where both parents are working, that there are two incomes coming into the household, which means that not necessarily there'll be somebody home there when the child comes home from school. The minister mentioned the walking distance, and I know she referenced my walk with a particular student and with a counselor from HRM, and we walked to and from a school, and I was also accompanied by some parents, and it was less than 2 kilometers. Less than 2 kilometers, and it took us, and I thought I was in reasonably good shape, but it took us well over an hour. I think if my recollection serves me correctly, I think the trip took something like an hour and 20 minutes, and I think the actual time for lunch at that time was 40 minutes. So the young student was late for school with mom and dad's permission, because mom was also with us. So it creates a whole bevy of implications, not only from the principle of a taxpayer-funded public education system, but also a principle of fairness. I want to, just for very, very briefly, talk about French immersion, because I think that French immersion is very, very big, a very big part of this equation, because what we have, and certainly in Halifax, Dartmouth, and the Halifax Regional School Board, is that in French immersion, it's not about choice. If a parent wants their child to be enrolled in French immersion, they do not pick the school. The school is determined by the school board. As a result of that, then what happens is the school board labels that student as out-of-area student. So once that student is declared as out of area, he or she is eligible, if I can use that word, eligible under the terms of the school board to the fee of the 200 or whatever, or the 400 fee, depending on how many children they have. So here's the case where a French immersion student have no choice whatsoever. They're labeled as out of area, and therefore subjected to a fee, which again is somewhat discriminatory against those parents that want to have their child learn French. And it also somewhat contradicts the Education Act, where the Education Act is trying to promote French immersion and encourage parents to enroll their children into French immersion class, not to put barriers in place that would deter them. So, Mr. Speaker, based on, I would say, probably the fairness, or I should say the unfairness of the policy as it exists, and further, based on, we boast and brag about a free, publicly funded, with taxpayers' money, education system, that charging extra fees just isn't right. And I want to, and if it's appropriate, Mr. Speaker, I would like to table, for the record, some some clippings and some writings that over the last several months related to fees, school fees, certainly the walk that we had out in Fall River, and I would just like to those be tabled for the record. So certainly as education critic, I endorse the bill that the member from Kings West has put forward, and I look forward to this bill moving on.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with great pleasure I rise today to speak on this bill. This has been a contentious issue in my riding for some time. We have a lot of single parents out there that are working and trying to bring their children up, and it's very, very difficult. And if you add another fee onto the fees that they have to pay for a child to come up today, if a child is any kind of sports, no matter what it is, it's very expensive. And when a child goes to school, there shouldn't be those extra costs there. I mean, once in a while you may go on a field trip or something like that you have to raise some money for, but not on a daily basis if a student has to go there. And also, if you have a large family, the impact is very, very, very negative. And the Halifax Regional School Board is the only school board in Nova Scotia that does this. It doesn't make any sense, affecting, as the minister indicated, pretty well 8,000 students. That's a big economic impact in our communities. And also, if you look at young families that are trying to do all the things that bring their children up properly, and today clothes are so expensive for the children, and everything is so expensive. When the school board adds another fee, it's just another cost. Those costs should all be covered under the taxes we pay in our province. And sometimes it's something like this, and combined with a whole bunch of other things, it would stop families from doing things that they might otherwise be able to do. And that's not right today. And the other thing is that the children, when they go to school now, they should be looked after from the time they go to the school until they get home. So it's an all-encompassing package. As one of my other colleagues has said here, you know, even recess and lunch hour is a learning experience for the students, and it's all part of the culture that they grow up in and understand how to interact with other people, and that's very important in today's society. So those are all things we have to take into consideration. I know in my area we have a lot of families that struggle daily, very hardworking, dedicated families, but families that struggle. And if they have to add one more little struggle to their daily routine, it makes it more and more difficult for them to continue and do the things that they need to do to make sure that their family has the best possible education and the most opportunities possible to them in today's society. And I think that every family should be entitled to that. It doesn't matter where you come from or who you are. You should have that right in the province of Nova Scotia. If you want your daughter or son to become a lawyer or a doctor or a bricklayer, it doesn't matter. They should have that opportunity, and they should be the best that they possibly can at it. And in some cases, I think all these extra fees on things and other things that cost us so much money really, really hinders families from having the opportunities that they should have. It's very expensive to get an education today, especially in post-secondary education, whether it's through a technical school or a community college or a university. It's very expensive. So we have to have the provision in there that children get the best possible education in P to 12 that they possibly can, and it's our responsibility as provincial legislatures to make sure that that does happen, and does happen for every single child. We talked the other day about the program, the tuition support program for children with difficulties, and that's a very positive step forward. That takes those children and gives them an opportunity to move forward. And this bill does exactly the same thing for many, many more families. And it's important that it does move in that direction and that we see this happen and make sure that we have families every possible opportunity they can to get an education, a solid education for their young families. And a lot of people over the years, for whatever reason, haven't had the opportunity to get as much education as possible as they would like to have. Maybe it's a cost issue, maybe it was a family issue. Maybe they just didn't have enough confidence to go forward. And the people I represent and work with are very intelligent people, hardworking people, and people that, given the opportunity, will excel in our society, and that's what we need. We need people to excel in our society, and to show the rest of the country what a wonderful place we live in, and also to set up industries and make things more economically feasible in this province as we move forward, which has always been the case. Well, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I'm going to take my seat, and be interesting to hear my honourable colleagues have to say about this issue, but I'll be supporting this bill. I want to commend my colleague for bringing this forward and the excellent lobbying and work that he has done on this. I know he's fought hard in our caucus for many issues for young children, and I believe that that's starting to show through with some of the things. I thank the government for supporting it. I'm sure that the official opposition will too. This is something that is, as our past bill was, it's good for all Nova Scotians, and particularly where it only affects HRM in this case, it's particularly good for HRM. We're seeing increasing property taxes through the regional municipality on a non-stop basis. And this is one thing that will help families at least give an opportunity for the children to get a proper education at a cost they can afford. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
For Halifax Clayton Park.
Sorry, we're just going to move. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I simply wanted to say a few words about this bill because it's something that I felt very strongly about for many years. And in fact, long before I ever ran as a city councillor and before I became an MLA, I have had this very issue as a politicizing and polarizing issue in my own community. And it remains so to this day. And this is going to make a very big difference in the lives of parents and families throughout HRM. And I just wanted to put that personal face on it as we look at what this does. But in fact, my own home is about 2.34 kilometers from Rockingham School. And 3.4 was the magic number at which my children would have been bused. And every year it was a fight to see whether or not there was courtesy busing available, whether there were a few places on the bus that we could be guaranteed for the year. And generally there was no guarantee, maybe a little bit case by case and month by month. And it meant that all the families that lived where I was and beyond going to that, and further up I mean, going to that school had to juggle family responsibilities and work start times and lunch hour supervision. And it creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of trouble in people's lives. And this change in law will actually mean that the families in HRM will have one of the benefits that really families in all other jurisdictions have enjoyed. Because if your children are going to a big rural school or a consolidated school, all children were entitled to stay at lunch and still are. And there wasn't a fee because the majority of kids are being bused in, therefore everybody gets the benefit. With city schools, it came very much down to who lived close enough to walk home was supposed to be the measure of whether or not you were allowed to stay. But even if you're able to walk home, Mr. Speaker, that whole notion is predicated on an antiquated idea that your mom or dad are going to be home when you get there, or that you've got a grandmother or a caregiver that's home. And that's not the reality for so many families today. And this caregiving at lunchtime is a real problem. In my first year as MLA, I had a woman call who was in great distress because she had to come home every day. She'd managed to get into a program at Dalhousie, was doing dental hygiene at Dalhousie, but her child wasn't getting care at Park West at lunchtime. And therefore, this woman had to interrupt her day downtown at Dalhousie, zoom in her car back home to supervise at lunchtime so her child was safe at lunch, and then zoom back down to school again in the afternoon. You can only imagine how much that took out of her day, diminished her ability to be a good student, to look after all the other aspects of her life. It was a tremendous stress. And this year, Mr. Speaker, there was a case of a woman whose subsidized daycare was lost because she married. She had I guess, made a tactical area of getting married, changed her income, lost her subsidized space in daycare, and then discovered to her horror that she was not entitled to have her children at Fairview Heights School for lunch, that if she wanted them at the lunch program, she would have had to know that last March when the lineup took place and the allotted number of spaces were filled. She had no hope of getting her kids into the lunchtime program, and she was in the same boat, Mr. Speaker. She was working in Bedford and had to arrange to zoom back at lunchtime, somehow juggling her lunch around the children's being out at lunch. and completely undermining her effectiveness on the home front and at work. Mr. Speaker, it is archaic and beyond archaic and puts tremendous stress on families. And these are just two little examples that are repeated time and time again right across this municipality. And I called Carol Olson, the superintendent of schools for HRM, and she confirmed that this is really unique in the city because there are many other things to do at lunch. Our teachers don't stay at school at lunch. They primarily leave the classroom because there's a lot of things they can do at lunchtime, and therefore they have to have a program like Excel or a school managed program with staff to look after the kids. And they haven't been funded for that, and therefore they haven't done it. And they've just had very small programs operating. It's also pointed out a tremendous difference and hardship for people who are not bused. I mentioned the 2.4 kilometers, Mr. Speaker. 2.4 kilometers was the magic number that you wanted to be from school so that your children could get on the bus. As soon as you qualify for busing in HRM, and I'm sure anywhere else in the province, you automatically knew that your children were cared for from the time they were picked up in the morning until they're brought back at the end of the school day. And you didn't have to worry about the middle of the day and what was happening then. But if you had the misfortune to live closer and not be eligible for the busing, then immediately you have all these extra complications plus the cost of paying for lunch if you're lucky enough to be among the few that are allowed to stay. So you can only see that it's a double whammy for families that didn't qualify for busing. And I know at present there's a busing review going on. The province is looking at who should be bused and what distance is appropriate and so on. I mentioned my distance from my home to Rockingham School where my children attended elementary. And that was it's under 2.4 kilometers, but it's a very long and dangerous walk. It would mean going from Clayton Park West above Dunbrack all the way down essentially to the Bedford Highway. And that's a long distance for children to go, plus crossing Dunbrack Street, which is a very big and busy street. And I know I couldn't let my children do that distance alone, that's for sure. And so, again, it meant a lot of carpooling and a lot of other things happening because of the busing difficulties. So I know the busing review may also make some differences, but introducing this change to provide the same level of service and the same level of assurance to parents that live in HRM as is given to those that live in rural areas and small towns, I think is so important, Mr. Speaker, because we have got a reality of busy lives, two-income families. I can tell you when you go around the neighborhoods in my riding during the day, the vast majority of homes, there's no one there because they're at work. So you can't rely on a grandparent or a relative to be there because they live in Cape Breton and they live in other parts of the province. As you know, Mr. Speaker, with the out-migration, they're coming to the cities and they don't have the family support that is so helpful to any young family, but we're missing it in our cities. And it's important that we provide some level of assurance and comfort to the mums and dads that are trying really hard to make a living and make a good life for their families. And this is a way that we can update our rules, our laws, to recognize the reality of today's families and to make Nova Scotia a better place in which to live. Because I can tell you some of the people who call, and I'm sure other members of the legislature have had these calls from people who've lived elsewhere and have come back here that just can't believe they're not entitled to have their children at school during the lunch hour, or are shocked that their kids aren't bused because they came from other provinces or other places where busing was the standard for all. And we need to keep pace, Mr. Speaker. We often talk here about making our province the best place to live. That's what we want to do. And we want to attract young families back and young people back to have their families here in Nova Scotia. And I can tell you this is one small change that's going to make a dramatic difference in a lot of people's lives. And in my own community where I began about my struggles in the late 90s with our busing, we went through the same thing as is still happening today with families, banding together and refusing to pay their fees, for example. And we were threatened with our children being put out on the sidewalk at lunchtime, regardless of their age. That's a serious threat when you're a parent. You don't want to put your children in harm's way. And we had tried very hard to lobby at the time and had not gotten anywhere with changing the Department of Education or or the school board's rules about busing and lunch. So it's a very important issue. I can tell you when something like this is recognized among parents in a community, brings them together and they question how we're doing business here in this province. And this change, I think, will be something that gives them a little bit of faith, a little bit of hope that things will change and that we do care, all of us in this House, about making Nova Scotia a modern society that supports families and helps people to balance their work and family responsibilities. So I very much applaud this bill going forward. I support it 100%, and I appreciate the fact that we're here at second reading and it's moving its way through the legislature. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like at this time to thank the Minister and the member for Waverley, Beaverbank, Fall River, and all those who contributed to the debate on this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I close debate.
The motion is for
Second reading.
the motion is for second reading of Bill number 51. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried.
Bill 51, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 36, the Liquor Control Act?
Bill number 36, the Liquor Control Act. The Honourable the Minister responsible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me a great privilege to rise and speak on the amendments being proposed to Section 81 of the Liquor Control Act. Mr. Speaker, these amendments are intended to update and clarify the Act. The changes are designed to address the long-standing and antiquated rule with respect to employees of the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation. In short, Mr. Speaker, these amendments will allow Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation employees and their spouses to seek employment in other businesses that deal in liquor. The phrase, Mr. Speaker, dealing in liquor, as outlined in the present legislation, prevents Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation employees or even their spouses from seeking employment in a broad variety of businesses. The legislation now prohibits these employees and their spouses from working in a range of businesses such as restaurants, private clubs, or any other businesses that have a liquor license, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this is an antiquated and unnecessary prohibition that has hindered employment possibilities for many Nova Scotians, particularly those in smaller communities where employment options, Mr. Speaker, may be somewhat limited. Mr. Speaker, in communities both small and large, individuals often wish to explore part-time employment with both the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation and may also wish to supplement their income by working part-time as in a licensed establishment or a community club. But today, Mr. Speaker, they cannot legally do this. This seems unfair, and that is why we are proposing these amendments to the Liquor Control Act. But this proposal also has another benefit, Mr. Speaker. It would allow the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation to employ professional sommeliers or other product experts who may also work elsewhere in the industry. Amendments are also being proposed, Mr. Speaker, that will align the Liquor Control Act with provisions regarding conflict of interest and acceptance of gifts as outlined in the Members and Public Employees Act. Mr. Speaker, these are the same acts and the same set of standards that we have to conform to. These provisions will allow the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation to adopt a code of business conduct that will define acceptable standards of behaviour for the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation board members and staff to ensure that public trust is maintained. Mr. Speaker, I seek support from the members of the House for the enabling of these changes to the benefit of some 1,500 employees, Mr. Speaker, and the customers of the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to hearing the remarks from other members.
The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my comments on Bill 36 for the proposed amendments to the Liquor Control Act are fairly brief. I think it's worth noting for members of the House that in the bill briefing and the accompanying press releases from the Minister that subclause 2.2 was played down somewhat regarding the receiving of gifts. This clause gives members of the Board of Directors and employees and their respective spouses permission to receive gifts from liquor companies subject to the same rules that govern cabinet ministers. Sauce for the Liquor Commission goose may be sauce for the ministerial gander, but it appears that this new privilege being extended to board members and employees. They're modifying a ban on receiving gifts with a code of conduct for receiving such gifts, Mr. Speaker. The explanation of the bill provided at the briefing talked about couples in small towns, one of whom may have worked at the local liquor store, the other at the local licensed restaurant, and how that bill would affect them. Mr. Speaker, I can support that it's a reasonable expectation that people should have access to employment opportunities that are before them. But, Mr. Speaker, to date, there's been no justification given for removing the ban on gifts to board members and the NSLC employees, and replacing it with a code of conduct. The latter was presented as making the Act consistent with other legislation, such as the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act, Mr. Speaker. I will end with, it certainly will be interesting to hear the statements of the stakeholders in the industry during the law amendments process, Mr. Speaker, and with that being said, I'm willing to support it, moving on to the next step for Bill 36.
The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be also brief on this bill. I think there's some good things in this where an employee of the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation working part-time can also work at another establishment. I think that's something that should have been changed years and years ago. Unfortunately, it's just been identified now. I do have some concerns about the Code of Conduct conducting the giving of gifts to members of the board employees of the corporation. I do have some concerns about that. Being a former military contractor, one of the companies that I dealt with, if you left a pencil on their desk with your name on it and their supervisor come along and found it, they were fired and escorted off the building, off the premises immediately. And that stemmed from a lot of difficulties in the U.S. That happened years before that with tampering and with military contracts and billions of dollars going away. So our liquor corporation isn't that large, but when you start talking about a code of conduct instead of a moratorium or not ability to give things to board, that's a drastic change from what was there. So what is the code of conduct going to be? I'm going to be very interested in hearing what the minister's views on that are. And the code of conduct going to be put in regulation. And I'm always a little bit nervous about regulation because it can be changed at any time very easily. But I think the intent of this is probably good, but I'll reserve my views on that until we come back and hear law amendments and come back to third reading and see exactly what that indeed entails. But that's the only thing I see wrong with that bill, this bill. Everything else appears to be normal. And I look forward to the debate in law amendments and here third reading. Thank you.
I recognize the minister. It'll be to end debate. The Honourable, the minister responsible for the Liquor Control Act.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the comments from my fellow colleagues. They're always welcome, and I look forward to this bill as it moves forward through law amendments. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I would move second reading of the bill. Thank you.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 36. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill 36, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 1, the Trade Union Act?
Bill number 1, the Trade Union Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Bill 1, which proposes amendments to the Trade Union Act. We have said all along that this legislation deserves to be debated, and I'm glad that that day has now arrived. I'm glad because the opposition members have refused on a consistent basis to discuss this bill. Rather than discuss this bill, they have avoided the issue, stuck their collective heads in the sand, and wished that the issue of strikes in the healthcare system would simply vanish. They have played the classic political shell game of deflection, saying there are other larger problems in the healthcare system, something that we have never disputed. But never once, Mr. Speaker, never once have they answered how taking away one stress from an already stressed system can be anything but helpful, anything but positive. They have abdicated responsibility in a minority parliament to help safeguard the health and safety of the citizens of Nova Scotia in regard to this specific issue. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in this they have even been out of step with the International Labour Organization, a worldwide movement which was founded following the Versailles Treaty to protect and safeguard the rights of workers. Because the ILO, Mr. Speaker, has recognized that in certain sectors strikes may not be allowable. And they have stated on numerous occasions, time after time, Mr. Speaker, that there are such things as essential services where the right to strike may not be appropriate and some other fair dispute resolution mechanism must be found. To safeguard the misuse of this admission, Mr. Speaker, the ILO in 1983 carefully circumscribed what these services were, stating that they comprise services where, to use their words, the interruption of which would endanger the life, the personal safety, or the health of the whole or part of the population. And then the Committee on the Freedom of Association of the International Labour Organization provided a short list of such services, interpreted, as they put it, in the very strictest sense, and in first place, Mr. Speaker, in first place, the services they felt where a strike may not be appropriate were health services. And so I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation is finally being debated, because when Nova Scotians go into a hospital or into a long-term care facility, or when they're waiting for a paramedic, they deserve to know that their safety is not going to be put into jeopardy by a lockout, a strike, or a threat of a strike. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, this legislation deserves to be debated because it sets the bar. It sets the bar as a strong piece of labour legislation. Because this bill preserves free, fair, and impartial collective bargaining independent of government, and it supports workers' rights to free, fair, effective, collective bargaining. Mr. Speaker, we believe, and you're a worker too, Mr. Speaker, we believe that workers deserve nothing less, and we also believe that Nova Scotians deserve nothing less. Now, many people have asked me, as they've asked the Premier, why are you doing this? And our answer is always threefold. It's about leadership, it's about public safety, and it's about crafting good public policy. An important piece of legislation like this should not be rushed, Mr. Speaker. It has to be considered at a time when there isn't a strike, a threat of a strike, or a threat of a lockout. That is why my department, at the Premier's request, and the government took time to consult. That is why we took time to examine the very best practices, Mr. Speaker, from across the country. And that is why we took the time to publicly release a draft of the legislation more than a month ago for even further consultation. If these amendments pass, Mr. Speaker, the legislation will affect employers and employees who work in the healthcare and community services sectors, and this includes acute care, long-term care, home support and home care, and continuing care, and it will also affect ambulance services. There are approximately, Mr. Speaker, has been stated on several occasions, about 240 different collective agreements in place in these various sectors. They cover approximately 32,000 employees who are represented by various unions. Mr. Speaker, as Minister of Environment and Labour, I recognize the importance of maintaining a fair collective bargaining process where unions and employers are free to negotiate the terms of the collective agreements. The existing process will continue under the proposed legislation, and it's only after the collective bargaining process breaks down, only after conciliation has run its course, that the parties will proceed to binding interest arbitration if no settlement has been arrived at. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to express some disappointment with members of the opposition, some of whom have claimed that this bill takes away collective bargaining rights. Nothing, Mr. Speaker, could be further from the truth. The face-to-face collective bargaining negotiations between the union and the employer will continue as they have continued in the past. The new process will apply only after, and I repeat, only after, conciliation has run its course, and only if conciliation fails to reach settlement. In addition, Mr. Speaker, all outstanding collective bargaining issues may be brought forward for consideration under this new process. It's a process, in addition, which provides a number of dispute resolution options to the parties for resolving their differences. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, the parties themselves, both employee and employer, get to design the system that will be used to settle their dispute. They can create a custom-made system that is tailored to their needs. What I ask the members opposite could be fairer than that. It's worth repeating, Mr. Speaker, the dispute resolution options that are added in this draft legislation and now in this legislation are in addition to conciliation and mediation processes that already exist in Parts 1 and Parts 2 of the Trade Union Act. Now, when this process began, Mr. Speaker, many of us thought that interest or binding arbitration was the best way to resolve disputes. But thanks in large part to what we heard through the consultations, our thinking has evolved to also encompass binding mediation as a truly viable option to binding arbitration. And so we're happy to include that option in this bill which has come before the House. Under this new system, the union and the employer can have a mediated settlement or an arbitration decision that's binding upon them. It's up to them which route they choose. So in more detail, let me just sketch out the dispute resolution options. A, the binding mediation route. You'll recall this form of dispute resolution from the recent IWK strike. A mediator facilitates discussions between the union and the employer in an informal setting without a formal hearing. Unlike ordinary mediation, though, binding mediation is a process where the mediator decides outstanding issues at the end of the mediation if the mediator and the process has not resulted in an agreement. The mediator's decision, therefore, is binding at the end upon both parties. And I must add, Mr. Speaker, that while both parties, employer and union, can agree to choose this route, we've put into the bill the fact that the union representatives on their own, unilaterally, can choose this option if they so desire. So the binding mediation route is one route. The second route, Mr. Speaker, is the binding arbitration route. Arbitration is a process, as I know the members of this House know, in which both parties present evidence and arguments to support their position in front of a decision maker in a formal setting, who then renders a decision that's binding on the parties. Both the union and the employer have the opportunity to present evidence before this one-person or three-person panel and witnesses to support the positions on their interest dispute. I believe, as does this government, Mr. Speaker, that this flexible approach, the most flexible approach in any bill of this type in the country, of providing the choice of options by which the parties can arrive at an agreement, is a fair and impartial way in the healthcare sector to reach a binding outcome. It's fair and it's impartial, Mr. Speaker, because mediators and arbitrators are independent, neutral third parties. They are selected not by the government, Mr. Speaker, but they're selected by the parties and their representatives to help both union and the employers reach a settlement. This variety of options, and I'll state it again because it's true the very best in Canada for this type of legislation, provides flexibility, which gives both the union and the employer a great deal of control over the process. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it gives both parties as much control as is possible. And it's also fair and it's also impartial, Mr. Speaker, because, as I noted, mediators and arbitrators are independent, neutral third parties. They are selected by the parties jointly, and they help the parties reach their agreement, an agreement which is binding upon both the union and the employer. And so, Mr. Speaker, this bill is balanced, this bill is equitable, and this bill removes the stresses of labor disruption. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, this is a modern solution. This is a mature solution to today's collective bargaining process when public health and when public safety are at stake. And I'll go back to what I said before. The International Labor Organization, as members opposite probably know and should know, have sanctioned in essential services, and number one amongst those, they've stated, are hospital health care services. They've sanctioned the fact that this form of dispute resolution is appropriate. The International Labor Organization has stated that on several occasions. So it's a modern solution, Mr. Speaker. It's a mature solution to today's collective bargaining processes where public health and where public safety are at stake. It is time for this kind of legislation. Some might say that it's past time. And in this I agree with the words of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who of his own political party heritage stated in 1968, "Liberalism is prepared to experiment and innovate. Liberals must shed outdated policies and develop new ones in keeping with changing situations." Well, Mr. Speaker, as a society, I believe we've evolved to a point that we recognize that public health and public safety cannot be put at risk, but must be safeguarded. And indeed, as I've noted, the International Labor Organization, founded after the Versailles Treaty, operating in almost every country in the world to promote worker rights and worker safety, recognizes this fact, Mr. Speaker. Any disruption in our healthcare system puts patient safety and indeed the safety of the system at risk. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take just a moment now to respond to some of the criticisms that have been leveled against this bill. One of the criticisms is that if this bill is passed, we'll have fewer healthcare workers in the province of Nova Scotia. And one might respond facetiously that if that were the case, we'd have to put up a wall right now at the border between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, because, Mr. Speaker, every other province besides Saskatchewan and ourselves have some form of legislation. So if healthcare workers were attracted to a province where we didn't have this legislation, we'd be overwhelmed with them. Now, that's speaking facetiously, Mr. Speaker, but when I talk to healthcare workers, not one of them says to me that they chose their job because they checked we have the right to strike. There's no essential services legislation in this particular jurisdiction. The other criticism that's been leveled, I've already alluded to, that there's other more pressing issues in the healthcare system. Never has the Premier or the Health Minister or myself denied that there are more important issues. But, Mr. Speaker, I am a Minister of Labour. And if I can remove, through my department, one small stress from the healthcare system, which is already stressed, how can that be anything but positive? How can that be anything but beneficial? I've asked that, Mr. Speaker, of the union leaders, of opposition members, and I never get an answer. If you can take away one stress from a system under stress, why not do it, if you can do it in a fair way? Thirdly, one of the criticisms against this bill is that it will result in more illegal strikes. Mr. Speaker, in labor legislation, there is really no way of preventing illegal strikes. Right now, with our present legislation, we can have illegal strikes, as the members opposite know full well. The only way to prevent illegal strikes is to give as fair a system as possible, and that's what we're seeking to do. Members opposite and other people outside this chamber have pointed to the experience of Alberta, but they failed to mention Ontario or Prince Edward Island. In Prince Edward Island, Mr. Speaker, where they have this type of legislation, there hasn't been one illegal strike in the healthcare system. In Ontario, over the past 40 years, there's been only one. And even in Alberta, which has a very diverse system, they've not had any illegal strikes since the year 2000, Mr. Speaker. Moreover, as my colleague, Minister of Health Promotion, has pointed out to me on several occasions, already here in the province of Nova Scotia, firefighters and police workers are covered by a form of binding arbitration, and we have had no illegal strikes in Nova Scotia in those sectors. Fourthly, criticism has been leveled that there are not many strikes in the province of Nova Scotia, and we count a little differently, Mr. Speaker. There have been 100 institutions affected by strikes since 1987. But the point that we have made and the point that we have stated time and time again is that in the modern healthcare system, everything is so intertwined that it's no longer a case of one node going down and a strike can affect that and everyone moves to the other node. Everything's intertwined. A strike in one place affects the entire system. So even the threat of a strike, as we saw with the IWK, which was only a one-week strike, but a year before that there was a threat of a strike in all the hospitals outside of the Capital District Health Authority. One day, a strike in IWK, but before that, there was a threat of a strike in all the hospitals outside of the Capital District Authority, and cancellations had to be put in place because the system is intertwined. It's a modern system, and it's a system where even the threat of a strike can produce tremendous dislocation to people's lives. The strangest criticism, however, is a criticism which came out in a second report by a Labour specialist named Mr. Larry Haven, put out by the Centre for Policy Alternatives. And in this second report, which didn't get much press time, and I don't wonder why, because it was a bit confusing, but he stated that the system was under stress and it needed strikes to alert people to the stress that the system was under. The media asked me about that, and I said, let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. So the Centre for Policy Alternative paper is saying that a stress system needs more stress in order to fix that stress. Mr. Speaker, I find this incredible. The opposition parties on a daily basis, when they're in the House, point out to the Minister of Health that the system's under stress. We have managerial workers, one of whom is my wife, in the healthcare system who know very well what the stresses are under. This is a strange sort of objection that taking away stress is actually bad for a stress system. And so I find it very strange, and not surprised that the media haven't asked me to respond to that objection. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about respect. It's about respect for the collective bargaining process. It's about respect for workers' rights. It's about respect for the health, safety, and well-being of the public, as the Premier stated time after time. Mr. Speaker, this bill sets the bar for Labour legislation. Workers should receive nothing less because, I tell you, at some stage in the province of Nova Scotia, essential services legislation will come. And when it comes, this bill will have set the bar below which no government, I hope, will be able to offer less to workers. The public also should receive nothing less, Mr. Speaker. Your children and your parents, Mr. Speaker, like mine, deserve nothing less. And speaking of young people, Mr. Speaker, it must be noted, and this is a very alarming statistic for me, but it must be noted during the one-day strike at the IWK that 30 young people with mental health illnesses were released from the hospital due to that one-day strike. Think of the possible implications and the tragedies that can come from that. On the other end of the spectrum are the elderly. In this regard, a letter from Robert Cook, who is the CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Association of Health Organizations, puts it best when he writes in a letter which was sent to the three party leaders, and he wrote in it these words, which I read with interest and concern, because he knows the system very well. He writes these words, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table this after I've read it. As we all know, our healthcare system now operates at capacity 100% of the time. Patients admitted to hospital have more acute and urgent health issues. residents of continuing care facilities are more frail and have complex care needs. Take, for example, Mr. Cook continues, St. Vincent's Nursing Home in Halifax, which provides professional nursing care, medical care, and other supports to 149 residents. Only 10 of those residents, Mr. Cook states, could possibly be discharged to a family in the event of a strike, which leaves 139 residents to be cared for. The average age of the residents is 88 years, and many have complex health and medical issues. 80% of the residents have Alzheimer's disease or some form of dementia when they're admitted. It's inconceivable, Mr. Cook concludes, and I agree with him, that 20% or even 30% of the bargaining unit could provide a safe environment for these seniors. And I'll table this letter from Mr. Cook. If I may be allowed to speak personally, Mr. Speaker, as most members know, my wife died in the middle of the night in March 1999. And I can still remember, Mr. Speaker, as if it were yesterday, phoning the ambulance services in panic and them walking me through the CPR process while the ambulance sped to my house. Now, in my wife's case, Mr. Speaker, it was too late. The doctors tell me that she was dead before I even woke up. But I know personally, Mr. Speaker, as a result of that, as I know others do in this House, maybe some on the opposition benches, that even 1 minute of unnecessary delay is 1 minute too long when a human life is at stake. Mr. Speaker, the Baptist preacher turned politician, Tommy Douglas, has been called one of Canada's greatest citizens. And indeed, in a recent CBC poll, he has been named the greatest Canadian. But before Tommy Douglas, there was another great Canadian, a Canadian who was the inspiration, Mr. Speaker, for Tommy Douglas, a Canadian who founded the party which Tommy Douglas led and which has become known as the New Democratic Party. That Canadian was a Methodist minister turned politician, and his name was James Shaver Wordsworth. And in a book which he wrote in 1911 entitled My Neighbor, James Shaver Wordsworth describes the effects of strikes, and he has these words to say, and it will be a bit of a lengthy read, but I think it's important to listen to what James Shaver Wordsworth, the founder of the CCF, which led to the NDP, had to say. Mr. Speaker, let me quote from his book, My Neighbor. The public is more or less familiar with the methods which are used in the warfare between the employer and the workers. The employer takes the position, this is my business, and I intend to run it. I will submit to no dictation as to wages, hours, or conditions of work. He stands for the open shop, where non-union men and union men, this was written in 1911, have equal rights. He refuses to treat with or recognize the union. If hostilities commence, he may lock out union men or introduce non-union men to take the place of the striking workmen. He may blacklist the strikers so that they will find it impossible to obtain work in any other factory. He may bring an injunction against the men's organization as being conspiracy and restraint of trade, an injunction disregard of which is contempt of court and punishable by imprisonment. His strike breakers may goad strikers or their sympathizers to violence. And then he may urge that the militia be called out to quell the riot or protect his property. Industrial war passes, he writes, into civil war. The workers on their part claim, and the justice of their claim is being more clearly recognized, that they ought to have a voice in deciding the conditions under which they work. They insist on the recognition of the union. They may demand the closed shop, that is, that only union men be employed. As the only effective means of enforcing their demands, they may resort to a strike. If non-union men, scabs as they are called, are brought in, they establish a system of espionage, seeking to win over or to intimidate the strike breakers. They may induce allied trades to call a sympathetic strike. In excitement or desperation, they may resort to violence that often ends in bloodshed and always, Mr. Speaker, in bitterness. Finally, James Shaver Woodsworth writes, one side may yield, or better yet, there may be an arbitration followed by some sort of compromise. And then he concludes with these words, surely a stupidly wasteful method entailing great inconvenience to the public, disorganization to the industry, and hardship to the men, loss all around. And all this, he adds, all this might often be saved by a joint agreement by which the interests of the employer, the worker, and the public would be conserved. Mr. Speaker, we are not suggesting, and the Premier has been very clear on this, we are not suggesting applying James Shaver Woodsworth's wisdom to all sectors of society. We are confining it. We are going much, much smaller than he would suggest we go. And we're confining it to the healthcare sector, to firefighters, and to police, to those essential services recognized, Mr. Speaker, by the International Labour Organization as being services which are essential to the public health and safety of the population or part of the population. And in those sectors, Mr. Speaker, there has to be a different way. There has to be a better way of resolving differences and disagreements regarding working conditions or regarding wages. And so, Mr. Speaker, we have come up in this bill not with an agreement like James Shaver Woodsworth calls for, but with a process, which is even better, that allows workers and allows employers to come together and to craft in each individual system a fair method that is fair to both sides, of arriving at an agreement in all areas, not simply in wages, Mr. Speaker, but in all areas that affect their working conditions, which is fair to workers and yet preserves the ongoing continuation, Mr. Speaker, of the public health care system. Mr. Speaker, this bill is compassionate, it's respectful, it's best of its kind. For the safety of all Nova Scotians, it's time that it be passed into law. And I thank the members opposite for listening politely to this. I look forward to hearing what they have to say. I'd be happy to take a question. Oh. If you want to ask me a question, Honourable Leader, please feel free. I would love to entertain questions about this bill. I have gone across the province of Nova Scotia, speaking to media, speaking to individuals, saying, ask me questions. So, Honourable Leader, if you'd like to ask me a question about this bill, please rise in your seat and ask me a question, because my frustration has been that people will not look at this bill. I have had healthcare workers who said, you're taking away collective bargaining. I say, have you read the bill? They say, no. I say, read the bill. I've had individuals who say this or that. I say, read the bill. So, Honourable Leader, please stand in your seat if you'd like and ask me a question. Ask me a question about this bill and I will respond. I will respond on television with the leader of the union, of the NSGEU, who refused on 4 different occasions to meet with me to discuss this issue and to make it better. They wrote back and said, we don't want to discuss binding arbitration, but we want to discuss other collective bargaining issues. I wrote back and I said, fine, let's discuss them. Let's make those better, but I also will be bringing and putting this on the table. And I was turned down every time. But finally on television, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to have a discussion with Ms. Joan Jessom. And she raised on CTV television, she raised that there was a clause in this bill that, in her opinion, and the lawyers for the NSGU, would mean that the arbitration would always favor the employer. And I told her then, right away, I'd say, that clause is gone. 2 days later, I wrote her, the clause is gone. Because, Mr. Speaker, this bill is a fair bill. So, honourable member, please rise in your seat. Ask me any question you want about this bill. I'll speak to this bill. I'll speak to the fairness of this bill. I'll speak to this bill. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak to this bill because there is, Mr. Speaker, there is no fair labor legislation that deals with essential services than this bill in the country of Canada right now. So, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about this bill. My frustration has been that the opposition won't talk about this bill. They refuse to talk about this bill. They'll talk about wait times and emergency care, important things. I'm not saying. But, Mr. Speaker, those are important things, I'll admit that, and we talk about those every day in the House. But they stick their heads in the sand, and in one small way that we can make the system better, one small way, but one important way, they refuse to even discuss. They refuse to come to the table. We had a discussion, a consultation paper out there, Mr. Speaker, for over a month. And we didn't get one response from the opposition. We didn't get anybody saying it was better. So stand up, Mr. Leader. Stand up. Ask me a question. Yeah, no, you won't ask a question, will you? Because this bill is fair. We have to admit that. No one. Someone tell me how this bill is not fair. This bill is the fairest bill that we have in the country, Mr. Speaker. It allows for flexibility. Every collective bargaining item can be mediated in this bill. The union, Mr. Speaker, can on its own. If it's worried, because I've had union members who speak to me and who say, Mr. Speaker, well, we like arbitration, but you know, those companies, they can always afford better lawyers than we have, and I always, in my mind, sort of apologize to Robert Chisholm because he's a pretty good lawyer, and Mr. Pink's a pretty good lawyer, but anyway. And I know he's in the gallery behind me, but that's what they say to me, Mr. Speaker. That's what they say. They say the employers can hire better lawyers. And so binding arbitration, while it sounds fair, is not really fair because the employer can hire better lawyers than the workers can hire. That's been said to me on several occasions, Mr. Speaker. That is why we have the option of binding mediation. If the union, and the union unilaterally can say, listen, I'm a little worried that in binding arbitration, that formal court-like process will be outgunned because they'll hire better lawyers than we have, they can unilaterally, without the agreement of the employer, they can unilaterally say, we want to go the binding mediation route. We want to bring in somebody who's almost like a marriage counselor who'll know the details on both sides and be able to bring us together, and at the end, if there's no agreement, impose a mediated settlement. That, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what the NSGU at the IWK asked for. And that is exactly what in the papers they touted as being a fair system and a good system. And Mr. Speaker, I need to stress that. I need to stress that they are the only ones who unilaterally can ask for this. The employer can't say, I want binding mediation. The employer has to have the agreement of the union to go for binding mediation. Only the union can unilaterally ask for this. Mr. Speaker, I see that some members find this a bit humorous. I don't find the public safety of Nova Scotians humorous at all. I don't find the fact that we will ensure that that public health care system is there to the very best of our ability. I don't find that funny at all, Mr. Speaker. This government, this premier, this minister believes that what we can do on the Labour side to help safeguard the system, to take away stress from the system, is something that we should do, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I know the members opposite have made up their mind, and one of the parties made up its mind before even seeing the bill, Mr. Speaker. I know they've made up their mind, but I plead with them one last time. I plead with them one last time. If there's a fairer system to safeguard the public safety in the healthcare system, bring it out. Speak about it. Speak about it. If you want the ambulance services, Mr. Speaker, to be slowed down by that extra few minutes because they're on strike and they can only put 30% of their workers on, then, Mr. Speaker, if that's what you want, that's what you're going to end up getting. Mr. Speaker, that is what is being said to me by the silence of the opposition. That is what is being said to this government by the fact that the opposition refuses to debate this bill time after time after time after time. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I am glad, and this government is glad, that finally the opposition will have to stand and speak to this bill, not to other issues, Mr. Speaker, but to this bill, and tell this government and tell Nova Scotians how removing a stress from the system and helping the system work better in a way that's fair to workers, how that is a bad thing. Because, Mr. Speaker, I cannot understand it. I cannot figure it out. I must be a very stupid person. I must be a very stupid person because I cannot understand how taking away a stress from the system, when it's a system that already experiences a great deal of stress, how that is a bad thing. I don't understand that at all. I would understand that, Mr. Speaker, only if the rest of the bill wasn't fair to workers. But, Mr. Speaker, as I've stated time and time and time again, it is fair. It offers binding arbitration, or it offers binding mediation, Mr. Speaker. It lets the two parties choose what type of arbitration they want. I've heard some people speak to me from the paramedics that they don't like final offer arbitration. Mr. Speaker, I think that final offer arbitration is a good system, but in this bill, if they don't like final offer arbitration, they do not have to choose it. They can tailor-make the type of arbitration that they want. If they want to find some other form of arbitration that they think is better, this bill allows that. This bill is flexible beyond all measure, Mr. Speaker. This bill is the best type of labour legislation dealing with essential services of any bill in Canada. We have learnt from other jurisdictions. We have had the luxury, because every other jurisdiction besides Saskatchewan, which is talking about doing the same thing, Mr. Speaker, at least according to a recent CBC report, every other jurisdiction has had experience in this. And so we have had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, of looking at their legislation. My department has studied it. We pulled out the very best. We put it in a discussion paper, and that discussion paper was out for consultation. And, Mr. Speaker, I really do have to thank the staff of my department, the staff of other departments in government, for the yeoman work that's been done. The staff of my department have gone above and beyond, Mr. Speaker. They've put in countless hours after work is over to make sure that they have found the best practices, to make sure that they have the best information. I had one staff member who was researching what they did in the Far East and saying, maybe this is an idea that we can choose. I said, look the whole world over if you can. Find better legislation. Find something to improve this. We have always said, Mr. Speaker, we have always said, the Premier stated time and time again when the discussion paper was out, we stated, Mr. Speaker, that we'd be open to any compelling alternative, and we were. When the option of binding mediation came out, we accepted that. When Mrs. Jessam said that this clause is unfair and will skew the arbitration process, we got rid of the clause, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I do thank the opposition for listening to me. I feel sorry that they've made up their minds on this, because I think if they read the bill and considered the fact that it's fair to workers and protects public safety, they would support it. I hope at some time they do, because I know, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians support it. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin my remarks tonight on Bill 1 with a quote. Mr. Speaker, the quote is this: "Healthcare workers are tired of being the scapegoats for the problems in the healthcare system." And that quote comes from a woman whose name is Karen McKenzie, who is an X-ray technician in the Colchester Hospital in Truro. Karen has worked as a healthcare provider for 23 years, Mr. Speaker. She has never been on strike. Mr. Speaker, Karen, along with 17 other healthcare workers, met with me here on Friday the 23rd to give their point of view on Bill 1. And some of those workers are here tonight, Mr. Speaker, and with apologies for any errors or omissions, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who was at that meeting and what they said. Mike Gillis, the shift power engineer in the Capital Health District for 20 years, was there. Mike Gillis has never been on strike. Wendy Williams, a nurse who works in diagnostic imaging at the VG, who was injured as a nurse and now works in this different section, has been in the healthcare system for 31 years, Mr. Speaker. She's never been on strike. Anne Cunningham from Liverpool, who's a physio assistant, was at this meeting. She's never been on strike. Dave Lawrence, child care worker who is here with us this evening, who works at the IWK and has been there for 6 years, has been on strike for 16 hours, and with a lot of emotion, he told us about that experience, Mr. Speaker, and he said of the Premier, and I quote, "The last people he cares about is us. He has his own agenda." Mr. Speaker, Carl Kraus, an LPN from Soldiers Memorial, for 21 years has worked as a healthcare worker. He's never been on strike, but Carl talked about how difficult it is to get time off, to schedule your vacation, to use up all your overtime. Barb Vedito, who works in clerical now at the IWK, but has been a worker at Northwood since 1995, was there, Mr. Speaker. Sean Wilcox, an LPN from Cape Breton for 21 years, was also at this meeting, Mr. Speaker. Sean has been on strike once in 1991. He relayed a story in the meeting about leaving the picket line during that strike and going inside with other workers who were on the line. They put their pickets down, Mr. Speaker. They went inside when there was a car accident. They stayed until patients were stable, and then they returned to the line, Mr. Speaker. Jerry Judy Oakley, a nurse in critical care with over 25 years of service, never on strike, was at the meeting, Mr. Speaker, and she talked about the mandated 24-hour shifts that nurses face, the mandated overtime they face, the mandate to work on their days off that they face. And she said, there's no safety there for nurses. Gina Boyd, a clerical worker, 16 years, IWK, has never been on strike. And she said, Mr. Speaker, she watched the television ads that were sponsored by the employers. And she said, watching them tell the story of how we're putting patients in danger, we were sad, we were hurt. And Mr. Speaker, I've heard many workers talk about how they were angry because their tax dollars have contributed to the funding of those ads, no matter how you cut it, Mr. Speaker. Judy Davis, a home support worker with the VON in Truro and Tatamagouche, with I think 11 years, my handwriting wasn't the best at times, Mr. Speaker. She's never been on strike. She did participate in a strike vote. She recommended that the government members read some working class history. And just for the Minister of Labor, because I know he did make the effort to read a bit of working class history. For what it's worth, I believe that the Wordsworth bit he was talking about had nothing really to do with the right to strike. It was the struggle for workers' recognition in this country, which really did not occur until approximately 1944, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Sean Foley, who is here with us this evening, was at that meeting. Sean works in environmental services at the Colchester Hospital. Sean's been there for 15 years. Sean has never been on strike. Sean spoke very passionately, very eloquently, very coherently, and he said, Mr. Speaker, very rarely do we hear anybody talk about cleaners or kitchen personnel, maintenance staff as part of the healthcare team. Sean said, we all work short, Mr. Speaker. We are not the bottom end people. Nobody can do their jobs without us. You can't go into a dirty OR. Christine Van Zoost, acute care nurse from Hants Community Hospital. I believe Christine was here one day and introduced. She's worked for 36 years in our healthcare system. Christine has never been on strike. She has a great deal of experience on the Nova Scotia Nurses Union negotiating team, and she talked about how in some negotiations for essential services, more staff were required than the place regularly operated with, Mr. Speaker. Now that's quite the comment. Bernadette DeVoe, Capital Health operating room nurse, 25 years, had never been on strike. Lacey Costin, X-ray technician, the Hotel California, where you check in but you never check out. That's what they call it at the IWK. 3 years, she'd been on strike for 16 hours. Leo Lafort, LPN, stroke neurology at the Queen Elizabeth, 10 years, on strike one day in 2001. Leo talked, he had said, I have seen patients in hospital for a year. It's tragic. This is no way to treat our seniors. Kenda McKinley, RN, patient cancer care, VG, 23 years, had never been on strike. And she asked me if I would ask if we could pass the hat here to buy brooms for the nurses over on that unit, because they are frequently without the basics to do the work that needs to be done. And Paul Acker, lab tech at the Queen Elizabeth for 20 years, on a one-day illegal strike, in 2001, and Paul reminded people that in 2001, the workers offered 100% staffing in the cancer treatment and the veterans care units, and it was the CEO who refused and canceled the agreement or that offer. Now, Mr. Speaker, why am I telling you this? Well, Mr. Speaker, it's because this legislation is about taking away the legislated legal rights of these women and men and others just like them. These are rights they've had for many years, and Mr. Speaker, it's important that we be clear about that. Bill 1 isn't about taking away the rights or the powers of some diabolical union leadership or labor boss. It's about these people, Mr. Speaker. Many of these healthcare workers sit on the bargaining teams during collective bargaining. They are the union. It's their legal rights this government and this legislation would take away. And Mr. Speaker, they are the ones who will feel the consequences most of the loss of these rights, rights they've had for many, many years. Now, Mr. Speaker, I didn't run for office, nor did any members of the NDP caucus, on a platform that we would come to this place to take away the legal rights of any group. And now that I think about it, Mr. Speaker, I don't remember any of the government members on that side of the House having run on such a platform either. Yet here we are, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I think if a government is going to legislate away rights that already exist in law, rights that have been gained through a long and often difficult struggle, then there has to be a very strong case for doing so. And I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that the government has not been able to make that case. They have not been able to demonstrate that healthcare workers have abused the rights they currently have under the Trade Union Act. The overwhelming majority of collective agreements in the health and community services sector are solved without any labor disruption. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labor's own statistics indicate that in 97% of the collective bargaining processes, there are no labor disruptions. So this surely is rather strong, I think, evidence that the removal of the lawful rights for every single person who works in every single hospital, in every single nursing home, in every single health clinic, in every single residential care facility, in every single small options home, in every single home care service, in all of our provinces' ambulances, in all of our rehab and addiction services, and so forth, is not supported by the facts, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of healthcare workers. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's often argued that the rights of one group shouldn't impinge on the rights of others, and that all rights have reasonable limits. For example, Mr. Speaker, we have the right of free speech, but that does not give any of us the right to say hateful things that could lead to hate crimes against particular groups. Although the government has implied that in this case, this is a matter of patients' rights, they have not said this. And realistically, how could they, Mr. Speaker? This government provides no such rights to Nova Scotians as patients. They have not presented any patient's bill of rights, no guaranteed wait times, And we can speculate, Mr. Speaker, on why that is. It would mean that they would have to be prepared to uphold such rights 365 days of the year for everyone, for mental health patients, for kids in care, and in the courts awaiting assessment and treatment, for cancer care, for diagnostic services, for long-term care. So, Mr. Speaker, this too is not a good argument for Bill 1. So, Mr. Speaker, this wasn't in the government's election platform, and the case that healthcare and other workers have abused their rights has not been made, nor has the case of one group's rights impinging on the rights of another group been made. So what other good reason could there be for Bill 1? Well, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this is an area where the public is crying out for action. But, Mr. Speaker, wrong again. Only one member of the public responded to the Minister of Labor's discussion paper on this issue. Even polling done by the government and by various employers indicates the public are not at all convinced for the need of this legislation. Their concerns are with doctors and nurse shortages, with wait times, with routine cancellation of appointments and surgeries, with closures of emergency departments, poor treatment of mental health patients, and the disgraceful lack of long-term care beds and the neglectful treatment of our seniors as a result. Now, Mr. Speaker, again, remember what the government is proposing to do with Bill 1. They are planning to completely remove the existing lawful rights for the guy who mows the lawn, the woman who does the admissions or the discharge paperwork, the recreational director who plans the sing-along evenings at the nursing home, the social worker who helps get services in place for patients in the community, the ward clerk, the kitchen aide, the orderly, the nurse, the paramedic, and so on, Mr. Speaker. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this government talks about safety. Well, Mr. Speaker, who can argue with that? Safety is a good thing, an important thing. Healthcare workers will tell you this is their top priority. But, Mr. Speaker, they will tell you it's often very difficult to achieve safety when you routinely work short-staffed or sleep-deprived. They will tell you cancellations of procedures and postponements of procedures and rescheduling of procedures is a common everyday occurrence in our healthcare system. They will tell you these problems in the system are caused by too few workers. They will tell you that their rights should not be sacrificed on the altar of a healthcare system that has unsuccessfully adopted many of the just-in-time workplace techniques of the factory system, as if people's healthcare needs, Mr. Speaker, are a simple commodity that can be successfully predicted or manipulated. Mr. Speaker, they can't. Having reordered the system with inadequate resources to operate effectively on a day-to-day basis, this government now tells healthcare workers who already bear the brunt of this reordering, oh, by the way, there's an additional price you must pay with the loss of your legal rights, rights you rarely use. Rights that I must add, Mr. Speaker, that when they do use, have generally alerted the public to serious problems in the healthcare system. Problems governments have been subsequently forced to act on. So much for dealing with safety, Mr. Speaker. Bill 1 fails here as well. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would say that for all of our differences in this legislature, the thing we all agree on is that there are many difficult problems in the healthcare systems. problems that we must solve together, Mr. Speaker. Where we disagree is what areas to focus on and make a priority. Our priorities in the New Democratic Party are these persistent, structural, routine problems in our healthcare system that lead to difficulties with recruitment and retention of healthcare providers, the lack of resources like long-term care beds for our seniors, and unacceptably long wait times for diagnostics and procedures. For the NDP caucus, Bill 1 is the wrong solution for the wrong problem, and for this reason, I and my colleagues will be voting against it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if there's much I can add to the eloquent words of the member for Halifax Needham, who and I am somewhat surprised, Mr. Speaker, I have to admit, to have heard the Minister of Labour stand in this legislature and taunt members of the official opposition and of our party to stand up and debate, knowing full well that we had every intention of doing just that, Mr. Speaker. And I was somewhat amazed that the Minister of Labour would say such things as that the opposition parties are sticking their collective heads in the sand and that we abdicated our responsibility. Them's fighting words, Mr. Speaker. That's what those are. Mr. Speaker, my mom was a nurse, and I used her as an example in this legislature before during a debate on Bill 68. And 3 of my sisters are nurses. And my mom did a reasonably good job of raising all 10 kids. Some of us turned out okay. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, one of the lessons my mother taught me when I used to go to school and get picked on for whatever reason, I come home with a bloody nose or a bruised face, she'd say, "David, pick the fight you can win." Mr. Minister, Mr. Premier, you could have used my mom's advice. Nova Scotia has only had 3 hospital strikes in 25 years, and 2 of them lasted less than 24 hours. Now, one would wonder, why are we here debating this legislation? Why are we doing it? We've received hundreds of letters from regular Nova Scotians who support our position and the position of the official opposition, telling us not to take away the right to strike for healthcare workers. And Mr. Speaker, we also know the real reason why the government is doing this. It's politics. It's nothing more than politics, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. Mr. Speaker, as the member for Halifax Needham referred to, she didn't use the figure, let me use the figure, 97% of collective bargaining agreements in this province get solved between the parties. 97%. This campaign, those 97% of those healthcare contract negotiations are resolved, as I said, which is proof that the process works. What better proof do you want? What better proof do you want? I'm sure that there are things that could be improved upon, but taking away the right to strike of healthcare workers is not one of them. Mr. Speaker, in the last 4 years or so, as health critic for the Liberal caucus, I have spoken to healthcare workers from one end of this province to another. Not one
healthcare worker has ever asked me to please take away their right to strike. Not one. The minister refers to the fact that this legislature has dealt with taking away the right to strike from other collective bargaining units, firefighters and police officers. True, Mr. Speaker. They asked for it. They came to us and said that's what they wanted. And we gave them what they wanted after debating it. Again, that's what we're elected, that's what we're put here to do. But, Mr. Speaker, no one has come to the Premier or the Health Minister or the Labour Minister or any other minister or any member and said, please take away my right to strike. Nobody. Again, why are we doing it? Nothing more than simple politics, Mr. Speaker, nothing more than simple politics. The government plays politics as this one. Listen, you know, you have to realize that there are more important things to deal with in health care these days. The Minister of Health has been somewhat silent on this, and I can understand why. I can understand why, because he knows, I'm sure he knows that ERs in this province have been closed for almost 6,000 hours so far this year. Problem. Wait times. Big problem. Nurse shortages. Big problem. Doctor shortages. Big problem. Are the workers to blame for that? Absolutely not. Do they want solutions to that? You better believe they do. But again, the government puts the blame squarely on the workers in the healthcare system and tries to bring in legislation to take away their right to strike. It deflects, Mr. Speaker, from the real problems in healthcare. And it tries to convince the general public, by using that method of deflection, that the only thing wrong in the healthcare system is because workers have the right to strike. Everybody in this House, Mr. Speaker, knows that that is not the case. That is not the case. Mr. Speaker, there have been references, and again, I know that others want to have something to say on this, but let me say one other thing. The campaign that the government has launched, the campaign that has been joined by district health authorities, that has been joined by the Nova Scotia Association of Health Organizations, and the money that organization, $350,000 spent on a campaign, could have been put to much better use by putting some people to work in the healthcare system to help solve the problems that we are putting up with on a daily basis, Mr. Speaker. The minister took his traveling roadshow all over this province and had his webcast. I don't know how much that cost. I wouldn't even want to wager a guess. But the response was far from overwhelming. There were polls that were done out in the field between February and October of this year. We estimate those costs to be around $40,000 plus to do those polls. Think of the money that's been wasted. Think of all the other problems that are there in health care, and you just sit down and you say to yourself, why this and why now? Mr. Speaker, the other provinces that have introduced a form of essential services legislation, which the minister has dismissed from the start, it's questionable at best where it's in place. But again, I go back to the fact that in this province there have only been 3 hospital strikes. 3 hospital strikes in the last 25 years, Mr. Speaker. This was not a problem that begged to be dealt with. This was, again, it just doesn't make any sense, Mr. Speaker. I know there are other things that have to be said, and I want others to have that chance to do that, and we certainly want to hear from others. Mr. Speaker, let me make this final point. You know, the minister made reference to some very famous people in this country, Tommy Douglas and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and the fact that he made reference to what the Liberal Party was all about. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what this Liberal caucus is all about right now. This Liberal caucus is about protecting the rights that people have and not taking their rights away. Mr. Speaker, that's why the Liberal caucus will be voting against this when the time comes. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, let me issue my own challenge, since the minister is quite fond of taunting people over here. You want to find out where we're going with this, and you want to find out what the end result will be.
You want to have a fight, Mr. Minister? Then you call this for a vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to start off by sending my thanks. My thanks to each and every healthcare worker for the work that they do. I have never been so proud of such an esteemed group of individuals. We need each and every healthcare worker that we have in our system, each and every healthcare worker and more. And Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the member from Glace Bay just said, I and this government have never blamed a healthcare worker for anything in this system. Mr. Speaker, we have nothing but praise for the wonderful individuals that work in our healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, I too am pleased to speak to second reading of the proposed amendments to the Trade Union Act. As Health Minister, I'm very aware of the kind of impact a strike can have on the healthcare system. This past year, we have worked very closely with our district health authorities when labor disruptions threaten to interrupt service to patients. Now, just 1 year ago, our healthcare system was planning for a possible strike by members of the Canadian Union of Public Employees that had the potential effect to affect every hospital in Nova Scotia outside of Metro. The kind of planning and preparation that goes on behind the scenes on the lead up to a strike is intense, it is stressful, but Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely necessary. It is our responsibility, it is my responsibility to Nova Scotians to limit the impact a labor dispute can have on patients. Now let me share with you, Mr. Speaker, the two experiences that I've had this past year that reveals just how integrated our modern healthcare system is. The removal of one part of the system can cripple the remaining parts. Mr. Speaker, if I may, let me quote from a news release that the Colchester East Hants District Health Authority issued on October 27, 2006, in its efforts to share with the public the effects that the impending strike would have. And I quote, Colchester East Hants Health Authority is continuing its efforts to plan for a potential strike for more than 400 members of its staff represented by the Canadian Union of Public Employees, or CUPE. Negotiations between the union and the district health authorities broke off earlier this month, and members could be in a legal strike position as of 12 a.m. November 1st. Given the significant impact a strike would have on our ability to deliver services, we've been working over the past number of weeks to develop contingency plans should a strike move forward. CUPE represents the vast majority of non-nursing staff in the district, including clerical and administrative, examples of payroll, finance, registration, booking, shipping, receiving, health records, materials management, mental health outpatient services, pharmacy services, laboratory, blood specimen collecting and testing, rehabilitation, physiotherapy and occupational therapy, diagnostic imaging, X-ray services, maintenance and housekeeping, sterilization and reprocessing services, cardiorespiratory services including breath tests, asthma clinics, EKGs, dietary services, food service, and as nutritional counseling, and diabetes education. In the event of a strike, the CEHHA will be very limited in the services it will be able to offer. Services such as laboratory, diagnostic imaging, X-ray services, pharmacy, and surgery will only be able to respond to the emergency and urgent situations. To ensure the continued delivery of emergency and urgent services, it would be necessary to cancel all scheduled procedures, appointments, and clinics. Services will also need to be centralized at the Colchester Regional Hospital. All services at Lillian Fraser Memorial Hospital would temporarily be discontinued. End quote. Monsieur le Président, laissez-moi partager avec vous une des deux expériences vécues au cours des dernières années, relevant à quel point de notre système de soins de santé moderne est intégrée et que l'élimination d'un parti du système peut paralyser les autres parts. Si vous me permettez, je vais vous lire l'extrait d'un communiqué de presse publié par la Régie régionale de santé de Colchester-East Hants le 27 octobre dernier afin de partager avec le public les effets potentiels d'une grève imminente. La Régie régionale de santé de Colchester-East Hants poursuit ses efforts de planification advenant une grève potentielle par plus de 400 membres du personnel représenté par le syndicat canadien de la fonction publique. Les négociations entre le syndicat et les régies régionales de la santé ont été interrompues plus tôt au cours du mois. Et les membres pourraient avoir le droit de déclarer la grève à compter de minuit le 1er octobre. En raison de l'impact considérable d'une grève sur la capacité d'offrir des services, nous avons travaillé au cours des dernières semaines sur l'élaboration des plans d'urgence avenant une grève. Le SCFP représente la vaste majorité du personnel non infirmier de la régie, notamment le personnel du bureau et de l'administration. Exemple de services de paie, finances, enregistrement de réservation, expédition et réception, dossiers médicaux, gestion du matériel. Les services externes de santé mentale, les services de pharmacie, les services de laboratoire, les services de réadaptation, psychothérapie et ergothérapie, les services d'imagerie diagnostique, l'entretien des services ménagers, les services de stérilisation des retraitements, les services cardio-respiratoires, les services de diététique, l'éducation sur le diabète. En cas de grève, le régie ne pourra offrir que des services très limités. Les services tels que le laboratoire, l'imagerie diagnostique, la pharmacie et la chirurgie ne pourront être offerts que dans des situations d'urgence. Pour assurer la prestation continue des services d'urgence, il sera nécessaire d'annuler toutes les procédures, tous les rendez-vous et toutes les cliniques. Les services devront également être centralisés à l'hôpital régional de Colchester, à Truro. Tous les services offerts à l'hôpital Lillian Fraser Memorial seraient interrompus de façon temporaire. Fin de la citation. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this gives you a real sense of the impact that a strike may have. For those of you who don't think we have an alternative solution, let me share another real example of the impact of why our government feels that this issue is so important. Here is a public service announcement from last October by the Southwest Nova District, where CUPE represents 621 licensed practical nurses, laboratory technologists, diagnostic imaging technologists, respiratory therapists, EKG technologists, dietitians, mental health professionals, and many other workers, maintenance, material management, porters, sterile processing, and others. On October 27, 2006, and I quote, "We are now in the process of ramping down services in preparation for a possible strike," says CEO Blaise McNeil. At 48 hours before a strike is called, day surgeries only will be performed. During the strike, elective or non-urgent surgeries will be canceled. And during a CUPE strike, Southwest Health will close 63 inpatient beds, 9 beds at Roseway Hospital, 10 beds at Digby General Hospital, 33 beds at Yarmouth Regional Hospital, 5 mental health beds, 6 detox unit beds will close. Southwest Health will also cancel elective, non-urgent procedures, clinics, and tests. And within 48 hours of a confirmed strike date, people will be called if their booked appointments is canceled." End quote. Mr. Speaker, this is a real problem that we need to address. Women and children who are patients at the IWK Health Center experienced that firsthand in April, when unfortunately there was a strike, as the House has heard from earlier speakers. Mr. Speaker, Ann McGuire, the CEO of the IWK, recalls that her hospital was in turmoil in the lead up to the strike, and I believe her. Regrettably, there were surgery cancellations for 42 children and 17 women, and 474 outside appointments had to be canceled. Mr. Speaker, those people who say that it is not an issue with the public only need to read the mail I received during that one-day strike. One email sent on October 30th, 2007, quote, "Get this solved before some innocent child needs the IWK, and it is not there for them." Right now, in fact, there are contingency plans underway at our largest district Capital Health, where 2,400 nurses work. Mr. Speaker, please let me clarify a point on that, if I may. The government does not set those contingency planning wheels in motion. The employers and the unions are the parties that work on plans to put in place should a labor disruption affect the public. Mr. Speaker, I've said it before and I will say it again. Strikes do not help us address wait times. They make them worse. No matter how you phrase it, canceling appointments because staff are off the job does not help the system. As health minister, I know that there are many issues facing our health system, and let me say we are making strong inroads to address those. Anyone who says that we are not addressing wait times, Mr. Speaker, is wrong. Let me read a few clippings in the papers over the last number of months, which speaks to the hard work that we are doing as a government to address wait times. This one, written by Brian Medell in the Chronicle Herald as of September 16th, new MRI moves in, and talks about the new MRI that came online in Yarmouth. Might as well just stand there for a minute while I pass these out to you. This one is in the Advocate of February 7th, New Glasgow. MRI unit officially open at Aberdeen Hospital. Now this one, actually this is page 2, I believe, but also what it really talks about is MRI already proving beneficial. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that as of last month, the number was over 5,000 patients were being seen in rural areas and changing the wait times in our province. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is quick to point to wait times issues, and I can say that we have a prescription for wait times, as was listed in the Chronicle Herald, I believe, I forget the date, doesn't quite show here, on the $24 million that we were able to receive from the federal government to work on radiation oncology. Again, this one in the Halifax News or Halifax Daily News, cancer wait times get a $24 million boost. Patients to receive radiation within 5 weeks by 2010. Mr. Speaker, I love this one, which was on the cover of the Daily News on Wednesday, August 8th, 2007, and a picture of John Ross, or Dr. John Ross, who is the chief of the QE2 ER, new ER, long overdue. A $17 million investment in a new MRI, or new ER at Capital Health to make sure that the flow of patients and the safety of patients will be for. This one comes from the Daily News. This time it'll be the right size, which is a further continuation of the ER announcement. Mr. Speaker, a number of months ago, I had the opportunity to open the last MRI at the QE2, or the Capital Health District Health Authority, at the VG site with the Premier, and resonates with patients, where the 6 new magnetic resonance imagers activated across Nova Scotia in the past year have already had impact on patients' wait times. Mr. Speaker, we can talk about the $12.5 million MRIs, reducing the wait times. North America's mobile digital mammography unit, the first one, launched in Bedeque, and talking about how that will impact women from one end of this province to another, and helping that wait time in Nova Scotia. Again, we can talk about the Inverness-Oran, better access to mammography in Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, we can also talk about the province expands chronic pain services, making sure that we have chronic pain clinics across this province, really impacting the largest wait time that we had, which was in chronic pain. And just recently, we were able to celebrate the the new mammography technology celebrated at Yarmouth Hospital, the new digital mammography unit that was put in place at that hospital that, again, will help more and more Nova Scotia women. So, Mr. Speaker, when the members opposite, underline a lot of the other issues that we have in the healthcare system and say that we are not addressing those, Mr. Speaker, I can, in my heart of hearts, say that they are wrong, that we are doing everything that we can to make that system better and better and better. In my heart, I know I am doing the right thing, as I know the member opposite, in his heart of hearts, know we are doing the right thing. Those who work in the healthcare system know that it takes time to address a wait time. And we've been very, very proactive. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I respectfully listened to the members opposite as they presented, and I would ask the same from them. Those who work in the healthcare system know that it takes time to address a wait time. And we've been on that and been very proactive at this. There are many, many issues in health. And today, it's about resolving one of those issues that impacts the health system, as the Minister of Labour so well spoke to it. Mr. Speaker, I too believe it's our responsibility to find a better way to resolve our disputes when collective bargaining fails. We must ensure care is available when our mothers, our fathers, and our children need it most. And that's why I am in favor of these amendments. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP is opposed to this bill, which is an attack on the collective bargaining rights of healthcare workers in this province. We have a labour relations system that has proven it minimizes work disruptions, and although it is based on the right of workers to strike and managers to lock out. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, our system is the envy of the rest of the country. Negotiations are rarely simple, but the answer to those who would replace this system with another system might also be found in the words of Winston Churchill when he spoke about another messy situation, Mr. Speaker. Democracy, he said, is the worst form of government, except for all of the other forms that have been tried from time to time. He said that in the House of Commons in Britain on November 11th, 1947, Mr. Speaker. It might well be applicable to the circumstances in which we find ourselves today as this government attempts, for reasons of its own, to replace a system which has been working, which has been serving the people of the province of Nova Scotia, with a system that may well make the circumstances in this province worse than it is. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill is nothing more than a political tactic. Now, why do I say that it's a tactic? Let me explain. First, and most obviously, this was not a matter that was raised during the last election. It was not part of the program that was put forward by the members opposite when they were campaigning door to door around the province. They never raised it, never put it in their promotional literature. They never talked about it on the campaign trail. It was part of the agenda that they decided to advance after they had received the endorsement of those voters who chose to vote for them. Mr. Speaker, let's look to the Premier. It was not part of his leadership platform. I never saw it reported in any of the debates that they had. I never heard him talk about it in a public forum. I never heard him advance it as part of his new Nova Scotia. I never heard him talk about it in any of the in any of the debates that they had with the other leadership contenders. There was no forum for discussion, setting out what the government felt the problem was and asking for suggested solutions prior to them deciding that they were going to bring forward this legislation before they decided the result. And for a long time, Mr. Speaker, we on this side have been asking the government for a labor management board or a forum such as the one that once worked very well in this province that would look at emerging issues in labor relations and provide advice to the government. And I would note that the government put on their website a statement that they would be proceeding with a tripartite process. And they held, as far as we know, one consultation that never publicly reported its findings and never proceeded any further. Mr. Speaker, this is unfortunate. The government held no prior consultation with healthcare workers who are the focus of this bill. And astoundingly, they had no advance consultation with either opposition party to share the government's